People of the Eldar, fathers of men, the day has come to once again journey down the Hobbit hole. So as I speak, the summer is about halfway over. It will soon be fall. Fall means Hobbit Day. And last year for Hobbit Day, I posted my most controversial, and indeed most intentionally controversial and provocative video to date, I hope, arguing that the society of the Shire had strong dystopic elements that were overlooked for a variety of reasons. And I believe I made glancing reference in that video to an idea I had that I am almost 100% certainly reading way too much into, but symbolically, I think, is potentially fruitful. And it centers on the relationship between hobbits, water, and the Vala Ulmo. Everybody's favorite Vala, except for me. So one of the characteristic traits of hobbits as a people is their general fear of and distaste for water. And like so much else in The Lord of the Rings, this is usually played for laughs or for humorous effect by the narrators. But one of the points that I made in the dystopian Shire video was that just because something is portrayed humorously doesn't mean it doesn't have a potential darker side. And this isn't pure headcanon either. Tolkien acknowledges this. The gossipiness and the short-sightedness and the shelteredness of the hobbits is portrayed humorously, but is also, according to Tolkien, a source of some very real problems. And in the prologue, this trait is described in somewhat more serious terms. The elves of the High Kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and they dwelt still at that time at the Grey Havens away to the west, and in other places within reach of the Shire. 3 elf towers of immemorial age were still to be seen beyond the western marches. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone upon a green hill. The hobbits of the West Farthing said that one could see the sea from the top of that tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and fewer still had ever returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. And as the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves, and grew afraid of them and distrustful of those that had dealings with them, and the sea became a word of fear among them, and a token of death, and they turned their faces away from the hills in the west. So quite characteristic of Tolkien that a people who starts to distrust elves and turn away from the west and fear the sea to the point of loathing it is a people that has lost their way. Their distrust of the sea and water is in this passage very closely associated with their general forgetfulness of the world outside and their desire to pretend that it all just doesn't exist. And like that very complacency, this is a trait that develops over time because in their origins, we are told the forebears of the hobbits were known to live along the River Anduin. And it was while they were living along the Anduin that they began the Great Migration that first drew them into the affairs of the tall men and the remaining elves in the north, and kind of earned them at least a footnote on the pages of history. There's also the question of Smeagol, who starts out as one of these foundation stock hobbit-like creatures, and was apparently a habitual fisher and one who would go out in boats, and then his aquatic associations, if anything, intensify after he gets possession of the ring. And we'll come back to that, but the main thing to pick out here is that in origin, the hobbits are, if anything, comfortable and familiar with at least rivers, and also apparently a bit more adventurous than they would later become. The hydrophobia develops. It's not something that's innate or natural. So by the end of the Third Age, there's really one notable exception to this, and that is the Brandybuck family. And the Brandybuck family, as I've pointed out before, is exceptional in several ways. Not only are they relatively familiar with boats and rivers, but they're right up against the edge of the old forest. They're much closer to the outside world. They're much more prepared to deal with it and equipped to handle it. For example, it always gets me how Merry is leading the other three into the old forest and not denying any of the weird rumors about it, but just being very blasé about it. Yes, I think the trees are hostile, and no, you can't do that because they'll start to rearrange the paths. But he takes it all very matter-of-factly because Merry's just, awesome like that. So the Brandybucks don't seem to be in as much denial as the Hobbiton hobbits, and for this reason, they have kind of a bad reputation. They're mistrusted. They're, strange people that can't quite be relied upon to act in a respectable hobbity manner. Lobelia Sackville Baggins, when Frodo is, kindly but firmly escorting her out the door in the wake of Bilbo's disappearance, spits at him, you're not a real Baggins, you don't belong here, you're nothing but a Brandybuck, and says this, of course, with Merry pretty close by, and she intends it to be an insult. And Merry assures Frodo that it's not true, but it kind of is, because Frodo's mother was a Brandybuck, and he spent some of his formative years in Buckland before he was adopted by Bilbo. He's also got some Took in him. And if we're talking about being equipped to deal with the outside world, even when it gets weird and mystical and eldritch, Frodo ends up being the only person, not just hobbit, but individual, capable of dealing with the most significant factor in the outside world, which would be the One Ring. And having done so, his identity and sense of self have been so messed up, understandably so, that ultimately he has to leave behind the Shire. And where does he have to go? Well, of course, he has to go over the sea, which is not, of course, meant to be understood as a literal death, but symbolically, his sea journey is very much the end of his former life. So in a way, it is a death. And that's a pretty common association generally when it comes to water, all kinds of water, but especially in Tolkien. There's a ton of water in Lord of the Rings that frequently shows up either as some sort of barrier to be crossed, after which there's no turning back, or there's a sense that some final decision has been made, and also often associated with some kind of death, either symbolic or often quite literal. Frodo fords the Brynn to get to Rivendell, after which he thinks that he's made it, that his journey is over, but actually what becomes apparent is that, now there's no turning back. He's been brought to the place where he has to now accept the actual quest, which is not just to get the ring from the Shire to Rivendell, but actually to take responsibility for the ring being destroyed. The journey through Moria is bracketed by water. There's the pool out front that contains the Watcher that attacks them, forcing them to enter Moria kind of hurriedly, and then tears down the trees and stones behind them, blocking the gates so that now they have no choice but to go all the way through. And then afterward, when they emerge, after Gandalf has died, one of the first things that Frodo does after they kind of stop to catch their breath is he goes with Gimli to look in the mirror. And then, of course, they've got to, cross the Nimrodel to get into Lorien. To leave Lorien, they go by boat down the Anduin. They finally come to a point on the river where they have to decide what direction they're going to turn in, and Frodo makes the call that he is going to cross over the Anduin and go into Mordor, and leaves everyone else on the other side. So that's another, crisis point or decision that has major implications. Poor Boromir is set on a boat and pushed down the river, of course, and it's said that he sails all the way out into the sea. This is where Faramir sees him. Even during the siege of Minas Tirith, Aragorn, the returning king, comes by sea on a boat up the river, and he, of course, is going to bring an end to the old order in Gondor and begin a new chapter of its history. The ring, obviously, is lost and found in a river. Even Frodo's becoming an orphan is brought about when his parents drown in a boating accident. And that's how he gets to be Bilbo's heir. Now, am I saying that Ulmo killed Frodo's parents so that he could fulfill his destiny by going to live with his uncle and becoming the heir to all of his possessions? No, I'm not saying that. That would be insane and unfair to Ulmo and probably blasphemous. But symbolically, it's interesting that all of these very significant turning points all seem to be associated with water. So that's kind of how it functions from a literary perspective, as a device, as a symbol, and not infrequently as a plot point. What do we know about water from the perspective of the metaphysics within Middle-earth? Well, we know that it is among the elements most resistant to influence by Morgoth, which doesn't mean that it can't become corrupted, but that it's a bit harder to do so. So therefore, it often has sort of purifying properties. It is often scary. One of the early Elvish words for the ocean was the Great Fear, so it's actually quite common for the initial response to the sea, at least, to be one of terror. But also, it's in the sound of water, and specifically the ocean, that it's said the echo of the music of the Ainur can still be heard. And what is the music of the Ainur? Well, it's creation, yes, but it's also fate and destiny. Because the music generated not only the substance of the universe, but its history as well. And this is why the sound of the sea frequently in Middle-earth fills people with longing or yearning. Pretty much all of the elves seem to be subject to this. Tuor and Eärendil seem to encounter it as well. The sea seems to stir a desire to go seeking for something that maybe you didn't even realize you were missing beforehand. And finally, water is governed by the Vala Ulmo, who's kind of an interestingly paradoxical character. He remains very loyal to Manwe, and they work closely together, but at the same time, they typically seem to have different opinions on things. So he's both a loyal ally, but also, in some ways, an adversary. He dwells alone, he doesn't have a spouse, he doesn't have halls, and he only rarely takes physical form, in contrast to most of the other Valar. So he's not someone who typically is working closely with or in regular contact with the elves, at least not in the conventional sense. But at the same time, he inhabits all of the waters of Arda, not just the ocean and the deeps, but also the rivers and streams. So he has a really good sense of what is going on at any given time. He's frequently the one responsible for prophetic dreams or visions or messages that elves and men receive. And he has a great degree of sympathy toward elves and men, which comes out in different ways depending on the context. So in the very beginning, when elves first appear in Middle-earth and the Valar are debating what to do with them, most of them want to bring the elves over to Valinor where they can be protected. Ulmo is one of the voices saying, this isn't a good idea, we should leave them alone, and eventually he gets overruled. But the consensus in the later writings is that probably the Valar should have left the elves alone, and not been in a big rush to hustle them all out of Middle-earth where they really, belonged, even with the complicating factor of Melkor's violent destruction and covert orcification practices. But later on down the line, he kind of does a 180, and it's almost like for him, it's like, okay, we should have left them alone. We didn't. We interfered. We meddled. Now we have a responsibility to continue helping out. We've made a decision. The decision has consequences. There's really no way of telling which consequences could have been avoided if we had made a different decision, and therefore it seems like Ulmo's argument is, we're in this with them. We got involved. We can't just turn away when things start going wrong. And therefore, Ulmo is one of really the only Valar who continue to actively offer assistance throughout the First Age, even after the rebellion of the Noldor. And in the First Age, the form that this assistance usually takes is telling people they need to set out on some sort of risky, dangerous venture and shake up the status quo. So he tells Finrod and Turgon to leave their respective dwellings or settlements and go out and found hidden kingdoms, which will of course become Gondolin and Nargothrond, which helped to substantially delay Morgoth's inevitable overrunning of Beleriand. There's quite a lot of water symbolism in the Turin story, but the action that Turin takes that spells the doom of Nargothrond is bridging the river that was sacred to Ulmo and the way that he was protecting Nargothrond. So once you've bridged that, both literally and symbolically, you've foregone that protection. And then Turin's cousin Tuor ends up by the sea and is directly instructed by Ulmo to go, first of all, to gather the armor and helmet that Turgon left as a sign hundreds of years ago in Vinyamar, and then to go seek out Gondolin. And Tuor doesn't seem terribly convinced of his chances of success, but Ulmo insists, and of course Tuor is a good boy and listens and undertakes this venture and turns out all right because of it. Ulmo tossing him a conveniently shipwrecked elf as his guide probably helped quite a bit there as well. But then he arrives in Gondolin bearing a message from the god of the sea, and what is that message? It's time to leave what you think is your unassailably secure home. It's time to go out into the world again. And even though this seems like a horrifically risky and unnecessary idea, it's actually the only way to avert disaster. Now, Turgon decides not to listen, and we know what happens as a result of that. He gives a very similar message to Faramir and Boromir. Like, you gotta trust me on this one, guys. The way to protect your city is to leave your city and go north in search of a semi-mythical elven settlement that no one is really sure even still exists, and even if it does still exist, it's infamously well hidden, so your chances of finding it are low, or would seem to be low. But again, he turns out to be correct. And Frodo ends up in a similar position. Less clearly, directly informed by Ulmo, but it's the same story. You want to save the Shire, you have to leave it. You want to keep Sauron from getting his ring back, you have to take it all the way into the center of his land. And then they run into Smeagol, who's gone from just being like a boat-using proto-hobbit to being like a fishy, froggy, web-footed creature who can barely even stand to be on dry land and eats all of his fish raw. So Gollum/Smeagol is at this point a pretty nasty piece of work. I certainly don't think you could argue that his increased association with water suggests any kind of purification or moral goodness. If anything, it seems to be the opposite. He's most loathsome when he's being all aquatic and squishy and moist. But he's also become an instrument of fate, and a very potent one. It goes back to that idea of Gollum was meant to find the ring, Bilbo was meant to get it from Gollum, you were meant to inherit it, and somehow you were meant to run into Gollum, and he was somehow going to be involved in whatever the outcome of the quest was. So I don't really have a single conclusion or takeaway, but I do think it's really interesting how all of these things kind of tie together in interesting ways. Ulmo is the Vala who seems most committed to directly influencing the course of history such that, I guess, essentially the theme can be played aright and opportunities for redemption will arise. Mostly, he does this by summoning or commanding or warning characters that it's time to leave their home behind and undertake something that really seems like it has no chance of success. And usually what ends up happening as a result is, even if things go well and are successful, there's some sort of transition point after which you can never return to the way things used to be. So the fact that hobbits are afraid of water and Sam hates being in a boat, while on the surface it is just a kind of funny detail that just helps to kind of flesh out everyone's character and the different traits of the different peoples that Tolkien is populating his world with. It also works really well as another demonstration of how the hobbits have become so sheltered and insular and complacent that for them, disrupting the status quo is tantamount to death. They fear it that much. But on the other hand, we know that in the end, disrupting the status quo is the only way that the world can be renewed. And I don't know if Tolkien was consciously making note of all of these different connections when he decided to make Hobbits afraid of water, but I also don't think it was just entirely accidental. There's just too much going on. And that description in the prologue that has a much more serious tone makes me think Tolkien was aware of the dichotomy. Yes, it's kind of a goofy trait that seems fitting for a race of people who are very attached to the land and the earth, even to the point where they prefer to live in tunnels. But at the same time, it's very rarely a good thing in Middle-earth when people start hating the sea and turning away from the West.